The first warning did not come from the sky. It came from a cup of water beside 8-year-old Caleb Mercer's bed. One October morning in 1886, Caleb reached for it and found a skin of ice stretched across the top. His mother, Nora Mercer, stood near the stove in their Montana cabin and watched him break the ice with one finger. Winter had not truly started yet. That was the problem. Their cabin was already losing. Nora said nothing while she fed another split log into the iron stove. The flame jumped. Cold air still slipped between the wall logs and moved across the floor around her boots. In the corner, Caleb's younger sister Annie slept beneath 2 quilts with her knees drawn against her chest. Nora looked at the shrinking woodpile outside the window. Then, she looked toward the low ridge behind their homestead. Gray stone showed through the dead grass. By noon, she had made a choice that would give the whole settlement something to laugh about. Nora Mercer was 34 years old and had been alone with 2 children since her husband Samuel died beneath an overturned freight wagon 18 months earlier. Samuel had built their cabin quickly. Like nearly every settler around Willow Creek, he trusted pine logs, a steep roof, and a large stove. The structure looked strong. But Montana wind found every weak joint. Snow pushed under the door. Ice formed around the window frame. And no matter how much wood Nora burned, the heat rushed upward and disappeared. The previous winter had nearly emptied their shed before February. By March, Nora had burned 1 kitchen chair, part of the old wagon bed, and several fence rails. She would not do that again. That afternoon, she took Caleb to the ridge. She carried a hammer, a shovel, a length of rope, and an old notebook wrapped inside cloth. Caleb followed through ankle-high grass. "Are we digging a cellar?" he asked. Nora stopped beside a shelf of sandstone. No, she tapped the rock with the hammer. A clean crack answered. "We are building our house here." Caleb stared at the hillside. There was no timber stack, no foundation trench, no wagon filled with boards. Only stone. "You mean out of that?" Nora nodded. Caleb rubbed his palms against his trousers. Pa said stone houses stay cold. Nora crouched and placed the notebook on a flat rock. Its pages belonged to her father, a mason who had spent years building mining shelters in the Colorado mountains. There were rough drawings inside, low ceilings, thick walls, a fireplace set deep into stone, earth piled against the north side, small windows facing south. Caleb studied the pages. Nora pointed to one drawing. "Your grandfather built places like this where winters lasted longer than ours. Did they stay warm?" Nora looked toward their cabin. Smoke rose hard from its chimney. "We are going to find out. If anyone passing that ridge had heard her that afternoon, they might have called it reckless." Within 2 weeks, nearly everyone did. The Mercers began before sunrise each morning. Nora loosened stone from the ridge. Caleb loaded smaller pieces onto a wooden drag sled. Together they hauled each load downhill. Annie gathered pieces of broken limestone and stacked them beside the worksite as if she were sorting buttons. Progress came slowly. A full day of lifting sometimes raised the wall less than a foot. Nora's knuckles split. Caleb's shoulders developed raw patches where the sled rope rubbed through his shirt. At supper, neither talked much. They ate beans beside the old cabin stove while the new stone walls waited outside in the dark. The first neighbor to stop was Amos Greeley. He was a cattleman with a wide gray beard and a habit of speaking before climbing down from his horse. He looked at the foundation, then at Nora. "What are you building? A winter house? With rocks?" Nora kept spreading clay mortar between 2 stones. Amos laughed once through his nose. "Ma'am, rocks belong under a house, not around people." Caleb kept his eyes on the bucket. Amos pointed toward the timber cabin. "You already have a roof. Fix the gaps and buy more firewood." Nora pressed the next stone into place. I bought firewood last winter. Then buy more. With what? Amos had no answer ready for that. He shifted in the saddle. Stone will hold cold all night. Nora scraped excess mortar away. We will see. By Sunday, Amos had repeated the story at the store. By Tuesday, men were riding out of their way to look at Nora Mercer's strange walls. Some offered advice. Others smiled. One man asked Caleb whether his mother planned to bury the family before winter or after it. Caleb's jaw tightened. Nora touched his arm before he answered. Keep mixing. So, he did. That became her answer to nearly everything. When someone laughed, they mixed mortar. When someone warned them, they lifted stone. When cold rain turned the worksite to mud, they kept building. The walls became nearly 2 feet thick. Nora dug the northern side several feet into the hill. She kept the ceiling low. She built only 2 small windows. Most surprising of all, she made the fireplace narrow and deep instead of wide. Caleb questioned that. Nora held her palm inside the unfinished firebox. A large fire can make a room hot fast. She touched the stone behind it. But I do not want fast. What do you want? I want the walls warm. By September, the structure no longer looked like a pile of rocks. It looked like something the Montana prairie had grown around. Earth covered part of the roof. Stone walls disappeared into the hillside. A short chimney rose above the grass. From a distance, it looked too small for 3 people. Up close, it looked thick enough to stop a wagon. Then, Carpenter Edwin Hale arrived. Unlike the others, Edwin did not laugh. He measured the walls, checked the roof beams, studied the fireplace. He remained inside nearly 20 minutes. When he came back out, his mouth had gone tight. Nora wiped mortar from her fingers. Well? Edwin looked toward the western horizon. A line of dark cloud sat beneath the late afternoon sun. You built stronger than I expected. Caleb straightened. Nora waited. Edwin touched one wall. But strength is not the only thing winter tests. He pointed toward the roof. If moisture gathers inside these stones, ice can split mortar from the center. Nora looked up. For the first time all summer, her hands stopped moving. Edwin lowered his voice. And if that happens during a hard freeze, you may not know the wall is failing until it moves. That evening, the temperature fell 17 degrees before supper. Just after dark, Caleb stepped outside. A single white flake landed on the black stone beside the door. Then, another. Then, dozens. He looked toward the unfinished roof seam. Behind him, Nora came outside carrying the lantern. Neither spoke. Snow was arriving early, and somewhere inside their new stone house, there was still one weakness they had not found. Snow kept falling, while Nora Mercer stood beneath the lantern and studied the roof seam Edwin Hale had warned her about. The thin white line collecting on the stones did not look dangerous. That made it worse. A weak wall announced itself with cracks. Water could hide for weeks. Then one night of hard freezing could turn it into a wedge. Caleb stood beside his mother, with his coat pulled tight around his neck. Can we fix it? Nora lifted the lantern higher. We find the water first. By morning, 3 inches of snow covered Willow Creek. The new stone house was not ready for them to sleep inside. But Nora refused to wait for spring. She heated a kettle in the old cabin, carried the steaming water across the yard, and poured a small amount over different sections of the new roof. Caleb watched from below. Most of the water ran toward the southern edge. One section disappeared. Nora froze in place. Again, Caleb brought another kettle. She poured. The water vanished between 2 roof stones. They went inside. A dark patch slowly appeared near the top of the north wall. There, Caleb said. Nora climbed onto a bench and pressed 2 fingers against it. Wet. Edwin had been right. She climbed down and opened her father's notebook across the table. Several pages dealt with drainage. One drawing showed a shallow stone channel hidden beneath a sod roof. Their house did not have one. Caleb leaned close. We missed it. Nora traced the drawing with a rough fingertip. Yes, can we still make it? She looked toward the ceiling. We have to. For the next 2 days, they removed part of the roof they had spent weeks building. The neighbors noticed. Amos Greeley stopped again. This time he did not bother hiding his smile. Taking it apart already? Nora handed Caleb another clay-covered stone. Repairing it? Before you have even lived in it? Yes, Amos shook his head. Timber would have been finished months ago. Caleb looked at Nora. She did not answer. That silence bothered Amos more than an argument would have. He rode away. Caleb waited until the horse disappeared. Why didn't you tell him Edwin found the problem? Because finding a mistake does not make the house weak. She pushed another stone into place. Leaving it there would. They cut a drainage channel beneath the roof covering, then packed flat stones at a slight angle so melting snow could escape before reaching the inner wall. Nora added a narrow air vent near the floor on the eastern side. Another vent went high on the opposite wall. Edwin returned 2 days later. He entered without speaking. He held a candle near the lower vent. The flame leaned inward. Then he moved to the upper opening. The flame bent outward. Edwin gave one slow nod. You have airflow. Nora pointed toward the repaired roof. And drainage. He climbed up to inspect it. Caleb watched his boots disappear over the edge. Several minutes passed. When Edwin came down, dirt covered his knees. It should hold. Should? Nora's eyes stayed on him. Edwin looked toward the mountains. No builder gets to promise what winter will do. That sentence stayed with Caleb. The first week of November brought harder cold. The Mercers finally moved into the stone house. There was no celebration. They carried blankets, food jars, tools, 2 chairs, a table, and Annie's wooden doll. Their old cabin stood empty 50 yards away. Caleb stopped in its doorway on the final trip. He looked at the stove. For years, everything in their winter life had centered around feeding that iron box. Cut wood. Carry wood. Dry wood. Burn wood. Wake before dawn and burn more. Now the stove was cold. Caleb shut the door. Inside the stone house, Nora lit their first overnight fire. Only 4 pieces of split pine. Amos would have called it foolish. Their old cabin could swallow 4 pieces before supper. Nora waited until the flames burned high, then let them settle. The firebox heated first. Then the wall behind it. Then the floor stones nearby. Caleb placed his hand against the wall. Cold. An hour later, he checked again. Less cold. Before bed, it felt almost like sun-warmed rock in late afternoon. Nora let the fire die. Caleb noticed. You aren't adding more? No, it will be freezing by morning. Then we learned something. That night, Caleb woke twice. Both times he expected to see his breath. He did not. At sunrise, he climbed down from the loft. The firebox held only gray ash and a few red points beneath it. Nora was already awake. She had hung Edwin's thermometer from a nail. Caleb stepped closer. 61. Outside, the temperature was 19. He looked at the dead fire, then at the thermometer again. Annie climbed down behind him, barefoot. My feet aren't cold. Nora gave her wool stockings anyway. Caleb pressed both palms against the thick rear wall. It still held warmth. For the first time, he understood what his mother had been trying to build. Not a house that produced more heat. A house that stopped wasting it. Over the next 10 days, Caleb recorded everything. November 8. Outside, 22 degrees. 3 pieces of wood after sunset. Inside at dawn, 60 degrees. November 11. Outside, 14 degrees. 4 pieces. Inside at dawn, 59. November 14. Outside, 9 degrees. 5 pieces. Inside at dawn, 63. Their woodpile barely changed. People began noticing that too. Amos rode past one afternoon and stared at the small stack beside their door. "You hiding another pile somewhere?" Caleb shook his head. "That's it." Amos looked at the stone house. "You'll burn through that by January. We use about 4 pieces a day." Amos laughed. Caleb did not. The laugh faded. "How warm?" "Usually 60 to 65. Amos looked toward Nora, who was repairing a leather harness near the doorway. She did not raise her head. "You expect me to believe that?" Caleb pointed inside. "Come look." Amos stayed in the saddle. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then, he pulled his reins. "I have work." He rode away. But he looked back twice. 3 nights later, the western sky turned the color of iron. The wind stopped completely. Even the horses in nearby fields stood still. Nora stepped outside before supper and watched a bank of clouds swallowing the mountains. Caleb joined her. "Snow?" Nora rubbed her thumb across the edge of her coat. "More than snow." The next morning, Edwin arrived before sunrise. His horse's sides were wet with sweat despite the cold. He dismounted quickly. Barometer fell all night. Nora opened the door wider. "How bad?" Edwin removed his gloves. "I rode past the telegraph office." He looked at Caleb, then back at Nora. "A freight crew came through from the west. They said the temperature dropped 30 degrees behind this front." Nora's fingers tightened around the door latch. "When?" "By tonight." Edwin stepped inside and felt the warm air. His eyes moved toward the small fire. "You have enough wood?" "For weeks." "Food?" "Nearly a month." He nodded. Then he said the part that changed the room. "Amos Greeley's youngest boy is sick." Caleb looked up. "What happened?" "Chest cough. Been worsening for days." Nora turned toward the western window. Snow had begun falling. 1 flake. Then another. Edwin pulled his gloves back on. "If this storm becomes what they say it will, Amos may not keep that timber house warm enough." Nora looked at the stone walls that the man had mocked all summer, then at the narrow doorway. Their house was built for 3 people. Maybe 4. Outside, the wind suddenly struck the roof hard enough to shake loose a sheet of snow. Caleb watched his mother. She reached for her coat. "Where are you going?" Nora opened the door. "To bring the boy here before the road disappears." Nora Mercer had crossed less than 20 yards when the wind drove the first hard sheet of snow across the yard. Caleb ran after her. "Mother," she turned sharply. "Go back inside. I can help. You can help by keeping Annie warm." Caleb stopped. Nora saw the argument building in his face. She stepped closer and pulled his coat collar higher. "If I am not back before dark, bar the door. Do not come looking." That ended the argument. Caleb watched her disappear into the whitening field with Edwin Hale beside her. Within 5 minutes, he could no longer see their tracks. The stone house suddenly felt smaller. Annie sat beside the fire, holding her doll beneath one arm. "Where did Mama go?" "To get someone." "Who?" "A boy who needs a warm place." Caleb added 1 piece of pine to the firebox. Then he stopped himself. The room was already warm. He had learned enough by now to know that feeding the flames because his hands wanted something to do would only waste wood. So he sat near the window and waited. Outside, daylight faded into a dirty gray. Snow struck the glass in dry bursts. The wind pressed against the stone house, then slipped over the low roof. Nothing shook. Nothing rattled. The old cabin across the yard groaned under each gust. Caleb could hear its loose shutter slamming again and again. By late afternoon, the thermometer inside still read 62 degrees. Caleb checked it every few minutes. Annie noticed. You already looked. I know. Did it change? No, then why do you keep looking? Caleb had no answer. A little before sunset, someone hit the door. Not a knock. A body. Caleb jumped up and pulled the wooden bar free. Nora pushed inside first. Snow covered her hair and shoulders. Edwin came behind her carrying a boy wrapped in 2 blankets. Amos Greeley followed. Caleb barely recognized him. The loud rancher who had spent summer laughing at their stone house now had ice on his beard, and both hands pressed around his son's boots. "Close it," Nora said. Caleb shoved the door shut. The wind vanished at once. Edwin lowered 12-year-old Luke Greeley near the firebox. The boy's face was pale. His breathing came short and rough. Nora knelt beside him and touched his cheek, not too close to the fire. Amos looked at her. "He's freezing." "I know." "Then get him warm." Slowly, her voice stayed level. Amos opened his mouth, then stopped. This was no longer the man giving advice beside a horse. He was a father watching his son struggle for each breath. Nora wrapped another blanket around Luke and warmed water over the fire. Caleb watched Amos look around the room. His eyes stopped on the thermometer. 63? Caleb nodded. Amos stared at the small fire. "How long has that been burning?" "We added 1 piece this afternoon." Amos looked at him as if he had spoken nonsense. "1?" "1." Amos turned toward the walls. He placed a hand against the stone. His fingers remained there. No one spoke. Luke coughed. The sound pulled him back. The boy bent forward, chest shaking. Nora held the cup near his mouth. "Small drink." Luke swallowed. His breathing slowed enough for him to lie back. Edwin removed his coat. "Your ranch house was losing heat through the west wall." Amos sat beside his son. "I stuffed blankets between the logs. It wasn't enough." "No." Amos rubbed his hands together. The stove was red. Caleb looked at him. "Red?" "I fed it until the pipe glowed." Amos lowered his eyes. Still couldn't warm the bedrooms. No one needed to say anything after that. The wind set enough outside. By nightfall, the storm had covered the lower half of the window. Nora made cornmeal and dried beef for everyone. They ate close together. 7 people now occupied a house built for 3. It should have become cold. It did not. Body heat joined the warmth held in the stone. Caleb watched the thermometer climb to 66. Luke finally stopped shaking. Later, while Annie slept near him, Amos stood beside Nora at the firebox. "I was wrong." Nora looked at the coals. "About what?" "You know what." She adjusted a piece of wood with the iron poker. Amos waited. When she still did not answer, he continued. "I told people this place would kill your children." Nora set the poker down. "Your son needs sleep." Amos swallowed. "That isn't an answer." "No, do you want me to apologize?" Nora looked toward Luke. "I want him breathing well tomorrow." Amos lowered his head. For once, he had nothing else to say. Near midnight, the blizzard grew harder. The wind no longer came in separate gusts. It pushed without stopping. Caleb woke to a deep cracking sound from somewhere outside. He sat upright. Another crack followed. Then, a crash. Edwin rose from the floor. That was timber. Amos moved toward the window. Caleb knew what they were all thinking. A roof. A barn. Maybe a house. Nora listened for several seconds. "Stay inside." Nobody argued. At dawn, the storm had not weakened. Snow reached nearly to the top of the lower window. The chimney still drew. The vents still moved air. The walls remained dry. Caleb recorded 59 degrees before Nora rebuilt the fire with 3 pieces of wood. 3. He wrote the number carefully. Outside, the temperature had dropped so low that frost coated the inside edge of the glass. Luke woke around 7. His cough remained rough, but his face had more color. Amos touched his forehead. The boy opened his eyes. Pa? I'm here. Luke looked around. Where are we? Amos glanced at Nora, in Mrs. Mercer's stone house. Luke blinked. The one you said was stupid? Caleb looked down quickly. Edwin turned toward the wall. Even Nora pressed her lips together. Amos rubbed one hand over his beard. Yes. Luke closed his eyes again. It's warm. Yes, son. The boy fell asleep. For the first time, Caleb saw Amos Greeley look embarrassed without becoming angry. By afternoon, the storm became so thick that the window showed nothing but white. Nora began counting supplies. Food was not a problem. Water was. 7 people drank more than she had planned for. The outdoor pump was already buried. They could melt snow, but opening the door repeatedly would waste heat and bring drift inside. Edwin suggested collecting it through the upper vent. Nora shook her head. Too much risk of blocking airflow. Caleb looked toward the roof. What about the old cabin? Almost stared at him. In this? There are 2 water barrels inside. Nora knew it too. 30 yards away. 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. No, Caleb did not argue. But an hour later, another sound came through the storm. 3 dull strikes. Then nothing. Caleb moved toward the door. Nora caught his sleeve. What did you hear? He waited. There it was again. Bang, bang, bang. Edwin stepped closer. That isn't the wind. Amos stood. Someone was outside. Nora lifted the door bar. The moment she opened it a few inches, snow blasted across the floor. A figure stood barely visible 10 feet away. Then, another appeared, behind it. Caleb recognized the first man only when he fell forward into the doorway. It was Silas Reed from the South Homestead. Blood darkened one side of his forehead. Behind him stood his wife, Martha, holding a little girl against her chest. Their cabin roof had collapsed, and through the white behind them, more shapes were moving toward the stone house. Nora Mercer pulled Silas Reed through the doorway, while Edwin reached past him for Martha and the child. Snow came with them. It covered the floor in seconds. Caleb shoved the door closed and dropped the wooden bar into place. For several breaths, nobody spoke. Silas lay on his side near the entrance. Blood had frozen along his temple. Martha held 7-year-old Grace so tightly that the girl's face was buried against her coat. Our roof went down, Martha finally said. Nora knelt beside Silas. When? Before daylight. Anyone else there? Martha shook her head. We crawled out through the kitchen window. Silas opened his eyes, walked toward your chimney. His voice was weak. Couldn't see the house. Just the smoke. Nora looked around. 10 people now occupied the stone shelter. 3 children. 7 adults. The room measured barely enough for the Mercer family's table, beds, shelves, and firebox. Yet the thermometer read 62 degrees. Nora pointed toward the rear wall. Get Grace out of those wet clothes. Martha hesitated. We don't have dry ones. We do. Nora opened the cedar chest beneath her sleeping platform. She handed over Annie's spare wool shirt, Caleb's old trousers, and 2 thick stockings. They were too large. It did not matter. Grace needed dry cloth. Caleb watched his mother give away clothing they could not easily replace. She did not count the cost. She counted what was needed. Outside, the storm kept striking the hill. Inside, the stone held. By mid-morning, more knocking came. This time, Nora opened the door to find Mrs. Bell and her teenage daughter. Their stovepipe had torn loose during the night. Smoke had filled their cabin. They had abandoned it before dawn. 12 people. Then came old Henry Pike from the eastern pasture. His barn had collapsed against his house. 13. Near noon, Edwin stood beside the window and looked at Nora. If more come, we'll run out of floor. Nora checked the thermometer. 65. We still have heat. We need air too. She nodded. That mattered more. Nora checked both vents. The lower intake remained clear. The upper vent was beginning to gather frost. Caleb saw it at the same time. I'll clean it. No, I can reach it from inside. Nora handed him a wooden spoon, then stay inside. Caleb climbed onto the table. He scraped frost carefully from the opening. A thin stream of cold air moved again. The candle beside the vent flickered. Edwin watched. Good, it was a small thing. A hole no wider than Caleb's wrist. But by then he understood that survival could turn on small things. A blocked vent. Wet boots. One careless opening of a door. A forgotten roof channel. The house had not survived because it was stone alone. It survived because every part had been considered. That afternoon, the fire consumed 5 pieces of pine. More than normal. Still far less than the old cabin would have required for 13 people. Amos sat near the woodpile counting what remained. 48 pieces. Nora nodded. At 5 or 6 a day, we're fine. If this lasts another week, we're still fine. Amos stared at the stack. His ranch had burned more than that in 2 days. He said nothing. Luke was breathing easier now. He sat wrapped in a blanket beside Annie. Grace sat with them. The 3 children played a quiet game using dried beans as pieces. The adults spoke in low voices. Nobody mocked the walls. Nobody called the house foolish. Every time the wind struck, eyes moved toward the ceiling. The ceiling never moved. Late that night came the hardest blow. A deep impact shook the door. Everyone woke. Another impact followed. Edwin grabbed the lantern. Something's against it. Nora listened. Scraping, then another thud. Snowdrift, Caleb thought. Edwin disagreed. Branch, there were no trees close enough. Amos stood. Part of the old cabin. That was possible. The abandoned timber structure stood directly west. If part of its roof had torn free, the wind could have carried it across the yard. Another crash hit the doorway. The wooden latch jumped. Caleb stared at it. The next strike could break the hinges. Nora crossed the room. Bench. Almost understood. He dragged the heavy bench against the door. Edwin pushed the table behind it. Silas, still weak, crawled forward and wedged a timber brace from the floor to the latch. Then they waited. The object struck twice more. The door held. After that, the sound stopped. Nobody moved the furniture until daylight. On the 3rd morning, the wind changed. Not stopped. Changed. The long roar became broken gusts. Patches of pale light began appearing through the upper window. Caleb wiped condensation from the glass. For the first time in days he could see beyond it, only a few feet. But the world existed again. By noon, the snow had stopped. Nora did not open the door immediately. They waited another hour. Then, Edwin and Amos moved the bench. Silas pulled away the brace. Nora lifted the latch. The door opened 6 inches and struck something. Snow. They dug with pots, boards, and their hands until a narrow passage formed. Cold sunlight poured inside. Caleb climbed through first. He stopped. Their old cabin was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Half the roof lay upside down against the stone house. One wall had collapsed. The chimney leaned at an angle. Pieces of timber were scattered across the white field. Caleb turned toward the shelter. The stone walls had not shifted. A broken roof beam rested against the doorway where it had struck during the night. Amos climbed out behind him. He looked at the wreckage. Then, at the stone house. For a long moment, his mouth remained open. People emerged one by one. Martha, Silas, Mrs. Bell, Henry Pike, the children. Each stood in the hard white sunlight and looked across Willow Creek. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys. Several barns were flattened. One cabin had lost its entire roof. Another leaned toward the road. Amos removed his hat. My place. His ranch lay beyond the western ridge. Nothing could be seen from here. Nora handed him his coat. "We'll go when the road is safe." He looked at her. "After what I said to you all summer." Nora closed the shelter door behind the children. "What you said isn't useful today." That was all. 3 days later, Amos returned. His family's house still stood. Barely, 2 bedrooms were unusable. The bunkhouse had lost part of its roof. His wood pile was almost empty. By the following week, he was back at Nora's shelter carrying a shovel. Edwin arrived with tools. Silas brought 2 draft horses. Martha brought food. Nobody had been invited. They simply came. Amos drove the shovel into frozen soil near his ranch house. "Where do we start?" Nora looked toward Caleb. He understood. "North wall goes into the hill." Amos nodded. "How deep?" 3 feet if the ground lets us." Edwin smiled. Then the work began. By spring, 5 stone houses were rising around Willow Creek. The men who once stopped their horses to laugh now hauled rock. Women mixed clay and sand. Children carried small stones. Caleb moved from site to site with Nora, checking walls with a plumb line and showing families how to keep roof water away from mortar. Nobody called him a child when he held that line. Years later, travelers passing through Willow Creek would notice something unusual. Among the weathered timber buildings stood low stone homes tucked into hillsides. Some had newer roofs. Some had patched doors. Most carried smoke from short chimneys on cold mornings. The first one remained near the old Mercer place. Its roof changed. Its windows changed. Families came and went. But the thick walls remained. And on bitter winter mornings, long after the fire had fallen to gray coals, the stone beside the hearth still held enough warmth for a child to place both hands against it.